in fact. But now we are delighted to introduce a great outsider. He's been on the show a couple of times before, and we're going to carry on chatting about matters happening in the UK to do with, in a roundabout way, with Israel. I'm delighted to welcome Brendan ONeill.
Hi, guys.
Brendan, welcome back to Outsiders. Now, you're here for a very special purpose, which we're going to get to in the second part of the show, which is a surprise for our audience. But before we do that, seeing as we have you on the satellite link, we'd love to pick your brains, firstly, about Boris and the burqa. Tell us what's been happening. And Theresa May shouting about Islamophobia. So give us a rundown, Brendan.
Yeah, so Boris Johnson, who's a very famous British politician, was our former Foreign Secretary. He made some comments about the burqa. He said the burqa is an oppressive garment. He said women who wear it look like letterboxes. He said if a woman in a niqab or a burqa turns up to a university lecture looking like a bank robber, then her professor has the right to ask her if she would remove her face veil. So he made some comments which were part jokey and part serious. And all hell has broken loose. He's been accused of Islamophobia, he's been accused of bigotry, he's been called a fascist, he's been called a little Mussolini. It really shows how completely and utterly censored and chilled and how much Islam is now protected from the same kind of discussion that other religions and ideologies will expect. So I think it tells us not about Boris's bigotry. He actually made very sensible comments. It tells us about an incredible climate of silence and censorship around the issue of Islam in particular.
If we ask you then, if we say, well, what are the hot button issues? We're seeing them, feeling them every day here in Australia. But from your standpoint in Britain and Europe, as a professional journalist and commentator, what are the kind of no-go zones for free speech in your day-to-day life as a journalist?
Well, I think one of them is the question of Islam and multiculturalism and European values and the question of how all these things intermingle. Anyone who raises any questions about this stuff is instantly denounced as a racist, as a populist. You know, populist has become a dirty word now, as a borderline Nazi. It's very difficult to have an open, honest discussion about these things. I think the most shocking example of it was in Britain over the past decade or so, where we've had 4 or 5 incidents of Muslim grooming gangs. This is where gangs of largely Pakistani, largely Muslim men gather together and basically traffic and abuse and in some cases rape mostly white working class girls. So it's a very good example of the tensions that multiculturalism can give rise to if we aren't keeping a careful eye on it, if we aren't having an open discussion about the problems. And it became very difficult for anyone to have an honest discussion about Muslim grooming gangs because you would instantly be shot down as racist. You know, what's your problem with Muslim men? Why are you so backward? So all those kinds of issues are really ring-fenced from honest public discussion, and I don't think anyone benefits from that.
Now, Brendan, one of the things you have articulated beautifully only the other day on Sky in the UK is the distinction, the clear distinction between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, because the left would love nothing more than to find moral equivalence between these two things and just have them as two sides of the same coin. But you brilliantly pointed out, explain to our outsiders how they are nothing like each other.
Yeah, I think anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are completely different things. Anti-Semitism is one of the oldest hatreds in the world, one of the oldest, foulest forms of racism. It has led to the deaths of millions upon millions of people over centuries, millennia, in fact. Whereas Islamophobia is a term that was pretty much invented in 1997 by a British think tank called the Runnymede Trust, and it's mostly about clamping down upon any kind of critical or strong commentary about Islam. So you cannot compare these two things. One, anti-Semitism is an extreme racism, which is driven by complete hatred for the Jewish people, whereas Islamophobia, that term, covers so many things. It covers people who attack Muslims, which we can all agree is foul behaviour, and it covers people who simply want to raise critical comments about the Quran or the burqa, as Boris found out, or about any aspect of Islamic practices and Islamic ideology. So to compare these two things is so utterly disingenuous, and it's driven by a really cynical motive, which is that there are these people, largely on the left, who want to cover up the fact that the left is now riddled with a new form of anti-Semitism, in fact. And they want to cover that up by constantly distracting our attention and saying, well, what about Muslims? What about Islamophobia? What about the fact that Boris is saying mean things about the burqa? So not only are they morally equating two very different things, but they're doing so to cover their own backs and hide the fact that some of the left has become anti-Semitic.
Brendan, absolutely beautifully put. Now, we've got a big surprise for our viewers. Brendan, you're a champion of free speech. You were also a good mate, an admirer, and I know he admired you, of the late, great Bill Leak. Don't go away. We'll be back in a second with a fantastic panel to discuss 2 years since Bill Leak's cartoon. We'll be back in a tick.